Good evening and a warm welcome to you all for our Black History Year event. So this is our second event of the academic year. We're really pleased to have you all here with us. My name is Dr. Deborah Husbands and I'm a senior lecturer in psychology. I also lead the Black History Year steering group, which comprises a committed team of colleagues and students from diverse cultural backgrounds and ethnicities. So I'm really pleased to be here with Dr. Doirean Wilson, who will share insights into her career life journey and the critical learning experiences of racism that she's endured along the way as a Black Briton born to parents who arrived in the UK from the Caribbean during the Windrush era. Dr. Wilson will describe how these critical experiences became her drivers for success, thus earning her recognition nationally and internationally for her the expertise that she has, for her area of expertise. So before Dr. Wilson speaks, just a brief overview of the agenda for this evening. So Dr. Wilson and I will be in conversation for about 35 minutes. In fact, Dr. Wilson will speak first, and then I will ask a few questions, after which I'll pose as many of your questions as possible from the chat for the next 15 minutes or so. So do please post your questions and your comments there, and we'll try and ask as many of them as we can in the time allotted, and then we'll close the event. So to introduce Dr. Doirean Wilson. So she's a multiple award-winning diversity expert and a human resources management senior lecturer in diversity practice and community engagement at Middlesex University Business School in London. She's currently a member of the university's Race Equality Charter Mark application, and she sits on the self-assessment team. She's also a visiting professor of religion and multiculturalism. And she was recently commissioned by the Metropolitan Police Service to assist them in their quest to improve cultural awareness and procedural justice at the Met. Her former roles include being a tabloid journalist for West Indian World newspaper. She was a television presenter for BVTV, which is one of the first Black cable TV television production companies in the UK. She's also the manager of 5 government-funded community projects aimed at addressing the underrepresentation of members of the BAME community across industry. Her voluntary roles include being the chair of the Nubian Jack Commemorative Community Trust. She's the patron for WEST, which stands for the Wilkes Education Scholarship Trust. And she's also a diversity advisory member for GUBA, which stands for Ghana UK-Based Achievement Awards. There's so much more to Dr. Wilson, but I'm going to hand over to her now to tell us something of herself and of her journey. Dr. Wilson.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you very much, Dr. Husbands, indeed. So, as the title of my presentation confirms, how did I get here? That's the question. And I'm going to talk you through my journey. And again, it's where I am today and how I was able to overcome the barriers to achieve success as of today. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I thought, let's start at the beginning. The beginning for me is my identity. And as Leviticus basically said, that identity is, particularly the I in identity, is more comfortable at home with the self. So understanding the self-identity, for me, let's go back historically. We know our names. Before that, we know who our parents are, etc. But I've gone way back. I had a DNA test. And as this DNA test, this is the result of my DNA test that makes evident my composition. That composition comprises of my West African heritage And as you can see, percentage-wise, that accounts for 79.3%. And in particular, an area in Nigeria in the north called Kanu, where the two dominant tribes are the Fulani and the Hausa tribes, which explains why quite often I'm stopped and asked, are you Nigerian? Although my parents are of mixed heritage, they were born on that sunny island in the Caribbean, in other words, Jamaica. The indigenous people of Jamaica were the Taino and the Arawak Indians. But slavery, trade, people came for trade and so forth. And as a result, my demographic makeup in terms of my identity comprises of all those heritage, as you can see on screen. The blue bits of the orb with me, an image of me in the center, represents the European aspect. So my mother's father was half Irish, my father's mother was half English, and the list goes on. So this is my identity of self. And my identity tag, which I say is a tag that should only be bestowed by the self, is Black British, born in Hackney, North London, of Jamaican heritage, mixed heritage, and my pronouns as she and her. Next slide, please. So as it says on the slide, I thought this is a nice place to proceed. Why I agreed to do this presentation, and the aim is to share my story of critical lived experiences as a small part of this event's learning process, and to provide know-how for overcoming barriers to success, in addition to presenting me as living proof that you too can become pioneers regardless of differences, which is what makes us unique. Differences are not an issue in terms of a problem. It's not a negative thing. Instead, it's a positive thing. And to also make evident that everyone is deserving of respect, to feel included, and to know that they are worthy. Next slide, please. So where I'm going next is where my journey in academia began. And it began with my critical learning experiences, the barriers that I used as drivers to success, instead of assuming they are constraints to success. Next slide, please. So I decided to elicit and present a few critical learning experiences, and these are experiences that are significant, with the greatest impact and most memorable. And my first critical learning experience was age 5. And at the time, I couldn't wait to start school. And I heard stories my parents would share and my relatives about my grandfather. His first profession was that of a maths teacher, which is a big thing then in the Caribbean. So I wanted to be a teacher. As young as I was, I knew I wanted to be a teacher. However, the day came when I started school. At the time, early 1960s Britain, where racism was overt and very evident. I still remember those signs in people's, homes, in the window: no dogs, no blacks, no Irish, and not quite understanding the meaning behind it, i.e. that it was about racism. Because at the time, I was raised to treat others how I expected to be treated. These are just some of the mantra that my parents would share. Sorry, I'm just trying to move, see if I can move this. Sorry. No, I can see the images of everyone, all the guests here. Is covering my slides, so just bear with me. I'm going to try, my best to move that along. Anyway. So, mantras such as "you reap what you sow," and as my parents explain, what you put in is what you harvest in life. and that knowledge is power, which is why education is important. And again, as they put it, education is a must. And I strongly believe in that. That is what's going to provide you with the elixir of knowledge in terms of in a liquid form. Let's use that as a metaphor. So what my parents also taught me was to speak up. And if you want to be listened to, this is something you must do, because I have voice and the right to be heard. I went to a Catholic school. So I was taught by nuns, and there were few pupils like me, Black female child. There was the odd one or two here and there. And what the nuns taught me was to speak only when spoken to, and children are seen and not heard. And you are a Black left-handed child, so I will go to hell because I owe the devil a favor, which used to make me quiver, because my parents were Christians. My mother was a deaconess. My aunt was a bishop. And to be told I was going to hell as a child was frightening. So what the nuns also did to me was to punish me for speaking up and asking questions, the very thing that my parents taught me to do. And having what they called was a half-bred, their words, not mine, father with green eyes. Because as I said initially, my parents of mixed heritage, my father's mother was half English. And they used to drag me to the chapel to say my Hail Marys because I was confused. In the home I was raised to have voice, speak up as long as you show respect and show respect to your elders. So be mindful how you address them. But when I went to school, I did not leave my parents' cultural socialization, as I regard as a form of brainwashing, at home. I brought it with me into the school paradigm. So speaking up meant I was being punished on a regular basis, dragged to the chapel to say my Hail Marys. Then eventually that graduated to the confession box, where I would be forced to ask the priest for forgiveness for, as they say, I had sinned. But one day I asked him, why is it wrong to point out that Tom is suffering? A fellow pupil I noticed was wriggling in the hall at the beginning of assembly because he clearly wanted to go to the toilet. So I thought, I'm going to be a good girl and put my hand up as Sister Mary was walking by. And I leant over and I touched her and I said, Sister Mary, I think Tommy wants to go to the toilet. Well, again, I was dragged out of that queue into the chapel, forced on my knees to beg for forgiveness. And I remember just staring at the statue of the Virgin Mary, wondering, what have I done? Because I did not understand. And I would pose questions to the priests, as I did when I graduated to the confession box, and ask whether it was true that being Black and left-handed meant that I was going to go to hell. And he responded in the usual manner by saying, never mind, child, God forgives you. To which I would always ask, for what? Although I knew back then that I wanted to be a teacher like my grandfather, who was a math teacher, as I said initially, I also knew that I never wanted to be the kind of teacher that the nuns at my Catholic school were to me and other pupils like me cruel. Just to put it bluntly, they were cruel. They weren't what I expected. My second critical learning experience, again, age 5, while out shopping with my mother in Chatsworth Market in Hackney. I don't know if any of the viewers or rather the attendees are familiar with Chatsworth Market, but back then there were lots of stalls and so forth, and we just happened to be passing a fruit and veg stall when my mother and I were surrounded by a group of white women who accused my mother of having a child with a white man. I was fair in complexion then, my hair was jet black then, and quite curly, and my eyes were lighter than they are now. They spat in my hair, my face, and in my mother's, who was also terrified and stood in front of me, pushing me behind her to protect me and to also pacify me. She grabbed a toffee apple, wrapped in that plastic red piece of paper. People might remember this or not. I'm not sure if they still do these toffee apples. And she unwrapped the toffee apple and gave it to me. And as I nibbled, I was trying to make sense as to why these women were spitting in my hair, in my face. I remember the spittle running in my eye, and I still remember trying to look and blink and wipe it away. And it gave me a double vision. I wept, my mother wept. Fast forward to my next critical learning experience, age 16. And coming up to, this is a very crucial time, real exams at the time, my O-levels, when I was asked by my headmistress, when I asked her, I do beg your pardon, because I couldn't wait. I was nervous about getting my results, but I had predicted grades, which comprised mainly A's and 1 or 2 B's. So when my results came through and I opened that brown envelope and I saw that slip with my results and realized I only received 1 A grade and 1 B grade, and the others paled into insignificance as far as I was concerned. And then I decided to go to my headmistress's office, something you don't do. And I went to an all-girls former grammar school in East London. And I asked my headmistress why I did not receive my predicted O-level grades after I was informed that I was on course to secure these grades. She responded by asking me what I wanted to do when I left school. Prior to that, she invited me to come back to her office at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And when I did arrive, she ushered me into her office, and stood there was 2 of my fellow Black female pupils. And one, her name was Doirean, I'm sure she wouldn't mind me mentioning it. They were also, and the other was Angela, who also had their results. They got unclassified. They didn't even get a grade. Both were clever pupils. And as we asked why we got these results and not the predicted grades, our headmistress asked what we wanted to do when we left school. I said I wanted to be a teacher or a lawyer. And Angela said she wanted to be a barrister. Doirean said that she wanted to be a midwife. To which our headmistress lowered her glasses, cleared her throat, then informed us that these are called profession girls and not for people from your coloured background. But I will provide all of you with references to work in the local tomato factory that was opening up in the high street. That was Leytonstone. Before I knew it, the words "stuff your tomato factory" flew out of my mouth, and I walked out of her office. I stormed out of her office and decided that I was going to be the very thing that she and both the nuns at my school assumed I would never be. So at that point, I was determined to pursue a career in education. So now the reason why I decided to share my critical learning stories with you, read from a typed PowerPoint slide, was because I wanted you to not only hear what I was saying, but to see and feel what I was experiencing along the way through my words as someone who is Black and British born and growing up in a country I know to be my home. These critical learning experiences motivated me to fulfill my quest to become an educator. So I set off on my journey by collecting a bag of, to use a metaphor, of diverse skills that would prove useful along the way. To be honest, I was determined to go over and above, to collect the skills and experiences than more than what I would need to qualify to pursue a career in education. So these skills came from a range of different work experiences, different careers, and so forth, until I felt now I'm at the point that I'm ready to move beyond. So that included my first career as a nurse. So I was trained at the Princess May School of Nursing in Bancroft Road in Whitechapel, and I was seconded to the London Hospital, is what it was called then. And although I gained a lot of skills in terms of care, patience, I cured my being scornful when it comes to human fluid, etc., cleaning bed sores and so forth. That was something, had I not had the experience, that I would assume I would not be able to do. But also listening to the stories of the patients of different generations, different ethnic backgrounds, and so forth. But also I gained an ability to show empathy and to be patient. My next career, because I decided that nursing really was not the career for me. So I decided to go back and study while I was thinking. I pondered my next career move. And while I was studying, my then English lecturer set an exercise in class. We had to read a chapter from King Lear and then compose 10 questions. He did the same. Mine and his questions were practically identical. So he pulled me aside and he said, I think you'd make a good journalist. And if you wish, I can mentor you. So I shrugged my shoulders and I said, yes. He taught me the art of creative writing. But besides that, I'm very creative anyway. I was an artist. It runs in my family. So I used to paint and draw. And in between, I actually got offered a place at St. Martin's Central Art School, which is internationally renowned, but turned the place down on the basis I did not want to do fine art. In retrospect, what it was, I'm an inspirational artist. I didn't want to paint and draw on demand. And to be honest, I was not even aware how prestigious that art school was at the time. So I was able, with Mark's mentoring and his tuition, to develop my creative writing ability. And he went on to become, as he was at college at the time, he had he formed a band. He was a bit of a musician. He used to write his lyrics. And, you know, I was privileged to hear some of those songs and view his lyrics. But that band became very popular in Britain and internationally. It's a band called Dire Straits, very popular in the 70s and 80s, etc. I went on to become a layout artist with West Indian World newspaper, which was one of the first Black publications in the UK, besides The Voice. And then they discovered I could write. And I eventually ended up having my own weekly hair and beauty column. So I thought, well, for me to write about the topic, it is only appropriate that I learn about the topic in practice, which I did. And then I was headhunted while I was there at West Indian World and leading up to West Indian World closing down. And I became also a lyricist because Cougar Records came in and they were looking for a lyricist. So I was given that opportunity to write as well as be the journalist. In addition to BVTV, Michael Mowat, the founder of BVTV at the time, came in, and I was then invited to do an audition as a TV presenter. And I secured that position. And then they realized not only could I write, but I had an ability, a gift, as they said, for observing a raw piece of footage and doing in one take a voiceover. I progressed to launching my own program, such as a program under BVTV called Community Reports, where I would go out to the community and highlight and spotlight different issues, such as health, diet. At the time, there was a significant rise in the number of people from the Black community with diabetes and also cardiovascular disease. Excuse me. So I would do a community, and I did do a community report on the issue to inform the community across North London. And I also had a program called Woman on Woman, or Women on Women. Again, women's issues such as the menopause, and the list goes on, which were very popular. Now, when West Indian World closed down, and the voluntary work that I was doing with both BVTV, writing with Cougar Records, I was offered a job to run a community project. Yeah. So these projects were, the aim of these community projects were to address the underrepresentation of people of color across industry, primarily from the Black and minority ethnic community. So I launched initially a project in Newham, and it was under the Mutual Aid Centre Community Project. That's what it was called, government funded. I eventually ended up running 5 consecutively, managing my own budget, and being the youngest regional manager in comparison to my white male counterparts in my early 20s, in comparison to the average age of my white male counterparts who were in their 50s and beyond. But I was the most successful. I also became a business training coordinator. So I helped to set up more than 34 businesses successfully. And while I was with the Business Development Agency in Hammersmith and Fulham, I actually wrote an Ethnic Women in Business program, which I delivered, and I did all the creative design with my own images and so forth, and delivered that program successfully. And at that point, I said, I'm ready to pursue my career in education. In between, I did other voluntary roles or undertook them. So as a former chair of trainers and mentor for the Positive Action Training Highway. So again, I helped to mentor mentors, or train them and develop them, and coaches for the benefit of the wider community. And also as a former business consultant, but primarily in the area of equality, diversity, and inclusion. I also was commissioned by the Black Mental Health Association, so I helped individuals, service users, to gain self-confidence, find themselves, and to also recognize that they too were worthy. So besides the skills gained and developed, there was a common thread on reflection that I wasn't able to recognize at the time, being someone who was proactive in these different roles, gaining these different skills and experiences, putting them in my bag of skills that I was going to use for developing my career and pursuing my career in education. But the common thread was equality, diversity, and inclusion as we know it today. So working in diversity across what we now know to be the 9 protected characteristics of the UK Equality Act 2010, and understanding what indirect discrimination, direct discrimination, and even discrimination, even though that was not the motivation, understanding it from a legal perspective, a practice perspective, and a personal perspective enabled me to develop my expertise, not just nationally, but internationally. So I'm a member of the Academy of Management, which is one of the largest and significant conferences, research conferences, academic conferences that is delivered across the different states of the US. So I'm a member of their Diversity and Inclusion Theme Committee, and I have been asked to enable the Academy of Management to be more inclusive to their participants and all those that visitors to the conferences across the board. I learned how to nurture respect in practice, not just the rhetoric, because there's one thing espousing the rhetoric and committing to being inclusive, but it shouldn't be taken for granted that everybody knows how to be inclusive. To be inclusive and to be culturally aware, one has to understand our own cultural standpoint. And also our meaning of respect is culturally situated. So as I progressed, I would create interventions that nurture greater awareness and understanding. And of course, I became the educator that I wanted to be, using my experiences to open doors in context and going in as someone with the wealth of experience and knowledge that I had at the time, enabled me to then foster a position of authority and to gain an ear, a listening ear, and to also demonstrate via my practice and my interventions created that help to nurture not only awareness, but help to address conflict. So educating people of difference to understand their sameness and to understand how that manifests. For example, as I said initially, culture is a form of brainwashing, as my studies reveal. So we bring our culture wherever we go. We wear our cultural cloak. We never take it off. We view others via our cultural lens. And our culture shapes our beliefs and our values. And the core commonly shared value for all is respect. But to understand somebody's respect, you have to understand their culture and vice versa. Because what we might perceive as respectful behavior in one culture could be somebody else's disrespect. But as my studies revealed, we take our respect meaning for granted. We live it. And only when we step out of our respect, as Mick Brooks says, into somebody else's, then we recognize our own in context and compare. An example of that, excuse me, is the left hand taboo. I'm left-handed. So in many cultures, and it's not just religious orientated, that this left hand taboo means the same thing. So whether you're from Morocco, Pakistan, India, and the list goes on, this left hand is disrespectful because in those cultures, people are socialized to use this left hand for the dirty jobs, for wiping your bottom, cleaning your shoes, and so on. So to offer this hand to greet someone will be assumed that you are giving me disrespect and not complying with my need for respect. So it is assumed you're doing it deliberately. However, if you're from a place such as Bulgaria, this left hand is the respectful hand because the belief is the heart tilts to the left. So anything on that side of the body is good. Yep. And also, another, because our respectful meanings, it manifests in our behaviors. So I've given you an example of the left hand taboo. You shouldn't offer drink, food, etc. with it if the belief in that culture is this is a disrespectful hand. Now, also, if you're socialized to believe nodding up and down means yes, and shaking the head from side to side means no, then you would assume when you nod to someone of difference in a culture, they will understand you. They would only understand if they've been socialized to believe the same. But using Bulgaria as an example, not the only one, but Southern Indians believe this is no and this is yes. But how would you know? Not unless you're culturally aware. So promoting awareness and understanding is also means for boosting, excuse me, one's self-confidence and reflecting on your own learning journey and understanding your learning journey, even though it might be different from somebody else's, it doesn't mean it's wrong. And my belief is that 2 mistakes makes a positive. It's what you learn from it. And don't let other people's meaning or their experience be your beating stick. Building trust is also about understanding people's cultural socialization and communicating our own. And also the need to address stereotypes. If you're socialized to believe that the children who live at number 57, when you're a child, you shouldn't play with them because they smell, and you happen to come across one of those children as an adult later on in life, in the boardroom, you might respond to the stereotype, excuse me, and open the window without reflecting on, which you should do, have I ever been in close proximity with that individual to know whether that perception is a reality? So these are just some of the things, the lessons to be learned that one has to take in and also bear in mind in order to nurture an environment of respect, not only for self, but for others. So seizing the opportunity to prove my worth, both as an academic, as a leader, as a diversity expert, and a professional practitioner, this is how I did it. And seize the opportunity by then investing in my future, in my profession, then it enabled others to recognize my worth. And that came from publications, etc. So I became the first diversity lead for my university, which was a pilot role for a year. I did it for 3 years on the basis, as confirmed by our then executive dean, there is evidence of your work across faculties for the positive. And I also was the co-chair of the university's anti-racism network. So you preside for a year. I did it for about 3, and I'm still a member of the anti-racism network. I'm chair of EduBate, which was an initiative that I created many years ago when I did a stint at Choice FM radio, which was launched by my cousin was one of the co-founders of Choice FM. So I initiated EduBate, which is an educational debate series based on current issues, which I brought to Middlesex. So every year I launched different initiatives looking at current debates and bringing key VIP leaders to talk on the topic, to share their experiences with students, with staff, and with wider community. I module lead today and have historically 24 undergraduate and postgraduate modules, 9 postgraduate programs, including the Executive MBA program, becoming the first female and person of colour to lead it in the UK. I regularly deliver diversity unconscious bias sessions as part and parcel of staff development for students and externally. And more recently, I was commissioned by the Metropolitan Police Service, as Deborah pointed out earlier on in her introduction, to promote their understanding of culture that reflects people of difference, particularly when looking at the fact that the Met Police Service serves Greater London in context, and to also help with stop and search to improve it. I've been approached by the Home Office. I've been invited into the Bank of England to share insight to my work and interventions. And I've also been invited by Deloitte, EY, and many other organizations, as I said, nationally and internationally, building up a reputation in that regard. So developing my niche as a diversity expert and an ambassador for my institution. Again, I do this via the different initiatives, projects that I'm involved in. I'm on the co-investigator, but representing the UK on an international study to ascertain the impact of leadership approaches adopted during COVID. So I collaborate with professors in Israel, Barcelona, South Africa, and the list goes on. I'm also editor-in-chief for what's called Inclusivity in Practice, which is a handbook for business leaders, sharing insight for different diversity issues, insights, expertise, and the likes. And I'm also, as I said, appointed as chair of the Academy of Management Diversity Inclusion Theme Committee. I have spoken on many conferences, academic conferences, other corporate conferences, and so forth. And I was a consultative advisor on faith and religion for the National Schools of Curriculum for the what was called the curriculum qualifications curriculum authority. I'm also patron for what's called WEST, which is the Wilkes Education Scholarship Trust, and many students is a national initiative. Many students have already, over the last 3 years, since the trust was initiated, many students have received a bursary of £1,000 towards their study. But it's primarily for those of African and Afro-Caribbean heritage going into their final year of studies. So again, building a track record of your experience is crucial. It's so easy to say, I feel disadvantaged. I'm not being recognized. I'm not being taken seriously. One has to take responsibility and make that happen. At the end of the day, it is very difficult for any employer to ignore someone who is competent, who's going to enable them to be more sustainable, to achieve their vision, their goal, particularly now in the environment that we live and work in, which is the VUCA environment, to use that acronym, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Here we see a list of just some of my publications. So to conclude, my mantra, the words that I use to inspire me is: one, use your barriers, my barriers, and I suggest you do the same, as vaults for success. Do not allow others' mistakes to be your punishment, which is a Buddhist mantra. Being different is what makes us unique. And take comfort in who you are. Be the example for others to follow. And equally respect yourself and learn how to respect others, because unlike food, drawing on the work of Richard Sennett, respect costs nothing. So it should not be in short supply. And using the Latin term nil desterrandum, never, ever give up. And finally, she is clothed in strength and dignity, and she laughs without fear of the future, which is a quote from Proverbs 31:25. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I do apologize for the frog that appeared in my throat from somewhere. I should have had some water at hand. I do apologize for that. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. That was such an interesting talk, and just sort of listening to your experiences which are just so full and rich and prolific. It's given us plenty of food for thought. There are some questions that have come in, and I have some questions, and I'm actually going to do a bit of a mix and match, because I think some of those questions speak to issues across your timeline. And if we take a timeline approach, I think we'll explore some of your lived experiences in a more practical sense. So we've got a question from Jacqueline, who asks, how did your early experience with the nuns, priests and so on, influence your present faith?
I was raised in a Christian family, and that's why my parents decided to send me to a Catholic school. That was the closest faith school in the area at the time. And one of the common mantras or tenets is to treat others like you would expect to be treated. Yeah, love others as you would love yourself. And so I held that in mind when I started school and throughout my journey. But when I realized, drawing on the work of MacNiff and Whitehead, the living contradictions practiced by those nuns who did the opposite, who punished me for being Black, who also punished me for being left-handed, which I realized from a young age was not godlike. Yeah, they were not living the faith in that regard. And my parents were not despot. They just said it's faith. Everybody has faith in some shape, and faith does not have to be motivated by religion. So that's something that I use. And if anything, I realized later on in life that I'm very mentally tenacious, and I have high emotional intelligence, as proven when I did the tests, to endure and survive the experience that I endured at a young age in 1960s Britain.
Yeah. So you have this really rich portfolio of experience that could essentially take you anywhere in the world. You could do anything. You've talked about your history of working in the creative arts and journalism and so on. So my question to you is, why academia, with its unique set of challenges for Black people who want to aspire to leadership? We know there's some specific challenges in that environment. Why you stayed with academia?
Because I said I had to live my value, and part and parcel of that is that I was on the other side of the table as a student. I didn't see anyone that looked like me teaching me, and particularly at an early age. They were not Black teachers. I didn't come across one. So how could they understand people from my background? So it's easy to impose your own cultural values, your way of doing on me, someone like me of difference, because my skin is darker, my hair is different, etc. But I was born in this country. Yeah. So it was important that I set the example and make others realize you too can become an educator. And we need educators who reflect the student community in all their manifestations, whether it's disability, whether it's, as I said, cut across the 9 protected characteristics, gender, race, beliefs, etc. We need people like us to teach us to understand how best to know how to teach people of difference to learn. And one of the things that I did in terms of one of my interventions, which I'll show you here, I carried out research amongst students, a global research amongst students at university. And I wrote this diversity best practice teaching and learning toolkit for educators to know how best to teach diverse students. And this toolkit is a toolkit in its own right. It's so robust. And I've had recruiters such as Perrett Laver asked to see this crude toolkit because they'd heard about it. I was at a presentation, and I heard people talking about my toolkit. And I was invited in by Perrett Laver to share insight to my toolkit. And they said, we operate across the world. We've seen many toolkits. We've never seen anything like this. It is a pick and mix of information. It shares insight to cultural taboos, for example. Insight to different cultures, whether it's caste, tribe, name, orientated, etc. It shares insight to the fabric of those cultures, the behaviors and so on, so you understand if it's cultures such as, for example, let me just draw on as one example, not the only one, of Hofstede, for example, who describes societies being born of different cultural characteristics. So those who are nurtured in high power distance societies are socialized to show respect to people older and more senior. It will manifest in their behaviors. In some high power distant societies, and they might be totally different countries, you don't look someone older and more senior directly in the eye, or you address them by their salutation first. Yep, sir, doctor, miss, etc.
Yes.
And that it also includes your family, your relatives, your parents, friends who are older. They might not be blood relations to you, but you address them auntie and uncle. That means you've been raised in a high-powered society. And it's important to understand that.
Yes.
So I share insight to these different cultural perspectives across the board so people can understand. I also, in the toolkit, is an overview of the legislation. And the UK Equality Act 2010 is more from 116 prior legislation. Yeah, race sex legislation, race legislation, the list goes on. So the UK Equality Act 2010 is very robust. And I share insight as to what constitutes direct, indirect discrimination, what is not tolerated, where it operates across the board, and so forth. This document is so robust. I also include case studies that cut across the 9 protected characteristics. And I also share insight to my research. Yeah. And my research that explore cultural meanings of respect and how that manifests in behaviors. And also the research I referred to initially to identify diverse students' preferred teaching and learning approaches and methods. What would motivate them to want to learn it more effectively, and also what they regard as the barriers to their learning. Each time, of the 4,000 initially, 4,238 respondents, although there was more than 1,000 types of responses, the top 5 included respect. Respect for self, respect from teachers, being taught by someone who looks like me, being taught by someone who understands my culture and my cultural background, was also cited as the drivers to successful learning and the barriers. Yeah, in the top 5. Yeah. With recommendations, and the list goes on. Links to films and so on that I've made, secured funding to make. I created an activity called If You Are Me and I Were You. Yep, and as you can see from this activity, there are different identity cards. So individuals will play this, participate in this exercise in pairs, which I've piloted in teaching and learning conference. I've piloted it all over the place, invited down to Cambridge to pilot it there and so forth, all over the place. And they work in pairs, select 3 to 6 identity tags that they know this is me, they feel comfortable to share with person B. And then you're able to do a swap to share insight to a critical learning experience that challenged one of your identity tags. So person B becomes you, or person A, in that experience. Now you're the Black female in this experience. What
Right.
would you be thinking? What would you do? And so on. And I've made a film. So it is very robust in context to make people aware, educators aware how to teach diverse students.
Right. So with just a couple of minutes left to go before we finish,
Yes.
I want to ask you, what advice would you give to people listening to this talk who want to make a career-defining move into leadership? And I want you to look at it from that perspective, and also what kind of self-care practices might they need to take along with them as they navigate that territory. So what's a self-care and what's a kind of advice to move into leadership?
What I would say is self-belief. Nobody can give you that but yourself.
Mm.
And equally, everyone knows what they are capable of. They know themselves and they should know themselves. And if that means you need to then write it down, create a table of your strengths, you can use a SWOT. Yeah. Weaknesses are not problems. They're an opportunity to develop self. Have a clear vision. Where do you want to be ideally? When do you need to get there or want to get there? And be realistic. And tiny steps. Don't leap initially because you could be disappointed. Little steps. You will get there. Yeah, but it starts with self, understanding self, self-belief. And people are only put off when they don't understand themselves. So they rely on other people telling them, you're good at this, oh no, you're not good at that, and so forth. You'll never achieve. People like you, they might use micro passive aggression to suppress who you are. No, know yourself. So many heroes, heroines have succeeded because of that. They know themselves.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that takes us right back to where we started, where you explained the importance of understanding the self, knowing our history. If we don't know our history, we won't know where we came from and where we need to be going. I want to thank you so much.
Can I just make a show very quickly, very quickly? One of my things that I use to motivate me is this. This is an image of my great-grandmother. You will see her slave number around her neck. She survived. You will see that her face is battered and bruised. She survived, which is why I'm here today. And it's the same for everybody else.
Thank you. Such an empowering sort of last thought and image to leave us with. So I want to thank you for such an interesting conversation, for sharing your life experiences in such a candid way. And you've left us all with a lot to think about, and hopefully we'll have some resources as well that our attendees will be able to explore. We'll post that information on the blog, and there will be a link to the blog in the chat. So on behalf of the Black History Steering Group, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Doirean Wilson, for spending time with us this evening. I want to thank those of you that have joined us for the talk, for giving of your time to be with us as well. And a quick reminder that this event recording will be up on our blog site, and the link will be posted in the chat at some point. Please continue to check in with our blog site for more news of Black lives, both at the University of Westminster and of course right across the globe. We feature them all. There'll be plenty of events next year, and our next event will be announced on our blog site soon. So once again, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. Have a pleasant one, and goodbye.
Thank you.